National Serving Community, talkradio.nyc.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the A Train to Sedona broadcast. The A Train to Sedona is also the name of a book I wrote, a memoir about my journey to love and compassion. I wrote it to inspire your journey. You can get a signed copy on lindamarsanico.com on Buy the Book page, also at retail and bookstores. If you want to read the first 7 pages for free, you can go on to Amazon.com. I also have a free gift for you. I call it the cheat sheet for high vibration living, a series of 7 exercises designed to help you bring your energy to a positive place, to bring your thoughts to the present moment. And in this uncertain world, it's wonderful to have this in your toolkit. And you can download a free copy on my website at lindamarsanico.com. I have 2 disclaimers. One, that this broadcast does not establish a professional relationship. And 2, that the opinions expressed on this broadcast do not reflect talkradio.New York City. Today, my guest is Ralph White. Ralph White is the president of the freshly launched new Center for Holistic Learning, New York. He is also the author of the memoir, The Jeweled Highway, On the Quest for a Life of Meaning. He was co-creator of the New York Open Center, America's leading urban institution of holistic learning from 1984 to 2022, where his vision and values guided the programs for over 30 years. The new Center New York, just like the Open Center before it, will present leading writers and speakers in the fields of wellness, social ecological change, inner development, world spiritual traditions, art, and creativity. Ralph White has presented internationally on such topics as contemporary spirituality, cultural transformation, and the history of the Western tradition. He was editor of Lapis Magazine, winner of the Alternative Press Award 2000 from Utne Reader, and taught the first fully accredited course in holistic learning at New York University. He has contributed articles on topics such as alternative community, the National Network of Holistic Centers, the Movement for Legal Renewal, and the philosopher Rudolf Steiner for Dragonfly Media, a network of magazines reaching an audience of 250,000. Ralph White was born in Wales, spent his childhood there, and his teenage years in the north of England. After completing a degree in American Studies at the University of Sussex, he came to the United States from Britain in 1970 as a Fulbright scholar. He was program director of Omega Institute for Holistic Studies in Rhinebeck. And I must tell you, listeners, his biography has so much more that this is a very shortened version. So I want to welcome you, Ralph White, to the A Train to Sedona.
Thank you, Linda. Glad to be on board.
I wanted to ask you what your early influences were that bring you to where you are personally and in your career.
You mean my early influences going back to childhood or adolescence or my early adulthood? Which would you like me to focus on?
I'm thinking of adolescence, young adulthood, and onward.
Yeah, well, I didn't grow up in a religious and spiritual environment. And I went to a very progressive university in England. It really took my personal spiritual awakening really happened after I'd come to America and at the age of 21 as a graduate student and answered an ad for a co-driver down Route 66 to LA. Of course, I was the first track of the Rolling Stones' first album, Route 66, so I always wanted to travel that. But I had my own spiritual awakening, should we say, in the desert, in the deserts of New Mexico and Arizona. Prior to that, I was more politically and existentially oriented, but then those vast landscapes in the Southwest had a big impact on me. And that's what really opened me up to a deeper perception, a spiritual perception of the world, the silence, the stars, the grandeur of the landscape. A big influence on me then when I left graduate school to really pursue spiritual and esoteric matters and to try to reconcile the intellectual and spiritual aspects of myself was Jung, Carl Jung. C.G. Jung was a huge influence on me in my early 20s. I got more out of Modern Man in Search of a Soul than I did all of Freud and Marx put together, frankly. So it was then another big influence on me in my early 20s was Dane Rudyard. I don't know if he's been a figure you've come across, an extraordinary man, a real Renaissance man, originally French, came to America when he was young and he was a musician. He was a philosopher. He's known mostly as an astrologer today, if he's remembered at all. But he was a wonderful, big picture thinker. One of my favorite books of his was "We Can Begin Again Together," subtitled "A Reevaluation of the Basic Concepts of Western Civilization." Only Dane Rudyard would subtitle a book that. So I would say Jung and Dane Rudyard in my early 70s were big influences on me. And probably if we leave aside the more intellectual element, just growing up, spending most of my childhood on the coast of Wales, the north coast of Wales, which was very beautiful. We lived not far from the Irish Sea. You could see the mountains of Snowdonia through the window. Just walking on those beaches. Any of our listeners or viewers who know of Dion Fortune, if that's a name, but she was a British writer on the esoteric in the early 20th century. But she and I both grew up around the same limestone massif, a great headland in Wales that jutted out into the Irish Sea. So that was a wonderful place to have silent. Of course, I knew nothing about mysticism at that time, but a silent sense of peaceful attunement to the beauty of nature. So I would say that, and and of course, I mean, I was living in the north of England in 1963 when the Beatles burst onto the scene. So of course, I grew up with the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Animals, all of those guys. I loved them all, and of course, that was a huge. It wasn't so much the spiritual thing, but it was to do with life and vitality, and it was getting you out of the grim, grimy northern industrial world that I found myself in as a teenager. A soot-covered city that was had been one of the places where the Industrial Revolution began. So it was a very repressed working class environment and a very grimy one, with where you had the 60 chimneys merging with the fog and mist coming down from the York moors that you would remember from Wuthering Heights and that kind of thing. So that rock and roll was a huge injection of vitality and freedom into what was a grimy and not very happy world that I resolved I needed to get out of there, which I did by getting to university, which was rare in those days in Britain among the kind of people I grew up in. And then on to America as a graduate student, because I did American studies as my degree in England when that was a very rare thing to do. it was a lot more fun studying America in the late 60s than it was
Mhm.
writing another paper on Chaucer or Milton or Shakespeare. We don't need
Mhm.
another one of those. So yeah, does that give you a sense of some of the influences? Yeah.
Yes. Of course, the British invasion was a wonderful invasion for us. They did
Yeah.
bring such vitality. And I remember reading that the Beach Boys from California said, "Oh my goodness, the Beatles are coming over. We're in competition. We have to produce some good music." So we had a
Yeah.
lot of good music at that time.
Oh wow, yeah. That was the best thing about being a teenager or a young person in the 60s was the music, yeah. And even on into the mid 70s too. So yeah.
So, what would you say the role of spirituality is in your life currently and in your adulthood?
Well, it's central, you know. I mean, I was a sort of alienated teenage existentialist personally who didn't see a lot of meaning in the world. You know, my father was in the thick of the First World War, landed in Normandy, and my grandfather was in the thick of the First World War, was mustard gassed at the battle.
Mm,
You know, I'd been aware of a lot of horror in the 20th century, and how could there possibly be some deeper level of spiritual reality in a world that permits this kind of tremendous violence? The notion of God that I was brought up with didn't make any sense, and I'd sort of moved on from that by the time I was 13 or 14.
mm,
So it really was that awakening that I mentioned, first of all, in the southwestern deserts. But you know, spirituality is what gives coherence and meaning and direction to your life. And once I had grasped that we're part of a larger reality and that there are levels of consciousness beyond just the everyday, banal level of interaction, um, that was a big insight for me. And then, you know, of course, I was on my own spiritual path in my early 20s. I hitchhiked to Machu Picchu from Canada when I was 23. And, you know, I had many experiences down in the mountains in the Andes. So when I came back, I really had the feeling that not only was the spirituality real and something I wanted to make central to my life, but then arises the question, how do you serve? What do you serve? Because once you wake up to a kind of spiritual view of the world, you want to contribute to society in some way. So for me, that involved three, well, actually, no, it's four centers. You know, I'd been living in South America, then in California, but then I went back to Britain, to Scotland. I spent 3.5 years at Findhorn, the what is now an eco village, spiritual community, holistic learning center up in the north of Scotland. So that was part of a big part of it. It gave me an arena to serve. It was a way to show. Spindhorn always saw itself as a center of demonstration. It was demonstrating that you could live, broadly speaking, in harmony with each other. And of
mm,
course, the main spiritual practice was attunement to nature. I've always
mm.
been a lover of nature, even though I've now spent 40 years in New York City. But yeah. So the spirituality it's central, it's core to my worldview, it's core to my meditative practice, and it's core to my basic impulse to be of value and service to the world and to try to contribute to an awakening of consciousness that takes us to in a more holistic, ecological, and spiritual direction, because that's been clear to me now for 45, 50 years that that's the way we need to go.
Mm.
I had when I'd been up in the Andes for months and came down to hitchhike down to sea level again in Peru and saw an industrial city. It wasn't a big one, Arequipa, but I saw a westernized industrial city after being in the mountains under the stars for months. And I just had one of those moments of intuitive clarity where I could see that Western industrial culture was both destroying the environment and our ecology and was really wrecking our souls and psyches as well, and that we needed to create something different. So ever since that point, and that's a long time ago, that was like 1973, my God, that's long. It really is a long time ago. It's been clear to me that we have to create something different rather than the consumerist,
Yes.
materialist, you know, the whole worldview that is wrecking the planet. So I've been, pretty much dedicated since then to trying to bring in the kind of ideas and practices, etc., that can awaken us to that larger spiritual, holistic, and ecological understanding of the world that we need for a sustainable future.
Well said. We are taking a break right now, but
Okay.
coming back, I read that in the world of holistic learning, you are considered the most knowledgeable person in the world. So I want to come back. Somebody wrote it on your website.
We did? Oh my
Yes, I thought, whoa,
God, I
this
don't
is quite something.
know
So when we come back, listeners, I want to ask Ralph about this, but we
that.
need to
Well,
take
wasn't
a
me.
break.
I didn't write it. Okay.
Are you a conscious co creator? Are you on a quest to raise your vibration and your consciousness? I'm Sam Leibowitz, your conscious consultant, and on my show, The Conscious Consultant Hour Awakening Humanity, we will touch upon all these topics and more. Listen live at our new time on Thursdays at 12 noon Eastern Time. That's The Conscious Consultant Hour Awakening Humanity, Thursdays 12 noon on talkradio.nyc.
Are you a high-achieving, growth-oriented leader? Are you interested in developing your authentic leadership while creating a healthy, inclusive workplace? Hi, I'm Dr. Mira Brancu, host of The Hard Skills on talkradio.nyc at 5 p.m. Eastern on Tuesdays, where we discuss how leaders develop the hard skills needed to make a greater impact. We interview experts, have live coaching, and tackle these challenges. Listen to The Hard Skills on Tuesday at 5 p.m. Eastern on talkradio.nyc.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC. Uplift, educate, empower.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the A Train to Sedona broadcast. I'm Linda Marsanico, today with my guest, Ralph White. Now, Ralph, for our listeners, would you say something about what holistic learning can be defined as?
Well, you could say that, the classic definition of holistic is the integration of body, mind, and spirit. But it goes more than that. Holistic learning also deals with becoming a whole person, integrating all those aspects of one's being, but also engaging with the world. And how do we live in a more holistic, conscious relationship with the world? So, an ecological worldview is just the other side of the same coin of a holistic worldview. And it exemplifies the interconnection of life. Ecology is that sort of classic holistic science that shows that when the moth eats something over there, it affects the frog over there. Everything is interrelated. That's one aspect of a holistic worldview. The more personal is the body, mind, spirit aspect that I mentioned. So it's all to do with reaching our full potential as human beings and developing a healthy relationship with the natural world around us.
Thank you for that. It gives me a fuller understanding. So now I want to know, what is it like to be at the heart of the New York center that you're starting? Of course, it's in New York City, one of the most, or if not the most influential city in the world. What is it like to be restarting away from the Open Center, which you curated for many, what is it, 36 years?
Yes, 36, or was it 38 years? Yes, it was a long time. Yeah. Well, it has its challenges, of course. I didn't expect to be 40 years after I started the Open Center with my old friend Walter Beebe. I didn't expect to be doing it again at this age. But it's a different time. We're not so much looking at the old model. The Open Center had a building, on
Yes.
Street and then on 30th Street. We're not working, we're using different spaces now. We're not putting out a 80 88-page catalog and sending it out to 80,000 people every 4 months. We can have a lot of our meetings on Zoom online instead of in person. And there's the different formats, purely online, purely in person, and hybrid, where you actually have people there in person, but you can also beam it out all over the world. We learned during the last few years of the Open Center how big an audience there is, of course, when you go hybrid. But you don't want to lose the intimacy of human interaction, especially after the pandemic. We're all in need of a bit more conviviality and social interaction and warmth, social warmth. So it's challenging to be doing it at this age, because we've got a huge range of connections. We've got 40 odd years worth of contacts and experience, but it's a different environment. And, it's very important for us to bring in a younger generation now, people in their 20s or under 35 or so. So how to do that? What are the different formats that are required? How is it different now for younger people? That's why I'm working now with a whole raft of younger colleagues who have that insight into what speaks to the younger constituency right now. And I can try to figure it out, but it's better to hear it straight from that generation. And of course, the whole holistic spiritual thing, it wasn't just affiliated with the baby boom. That may have been where it had its major breakthrough, but of course it's going on from generation to generation. I mean, I saw it when I was teaching at NYU. My students were totally into all of this. I was teaching the first accredited course in holistic learning at NYU, but I saw then that it's sometimes presented as just some baby boom thing, and then it's just flakes and so on who are into this. Now, this is certainly not true. There's a lot of intelligent, aware people of all generations who realize there's got to be this profound shift in our consciousness. And you don't see it written about in the media a lot because it's been a subtle shift. You and I probably remember the days when health food stores were little mom and pop operations and hole in the walls. And now, of course, we had Whole Foods, then Amazon bought Whole Foods. I mean, the way we used to look upon when I was at Findhorn, building a windmill and organic agriculture, it was all considered wild and crazy stuff. And trying to put solar panels up in the north of Scotland. Of course, that was years ahead of its time. So many of these things, alternative medicine, the New York Times 40 years ago dismissed every form of alternative medicine as snake oil. And that's just a few examples. So holistic perspectives have permeated the culture in a subtle way, so that now the Times and the Guardian, have regular columns on wellness because they like to present themselves as super sophisticated. Some of us have been doing this for 40 years. We're not all incapable of some healthy measure of discernment about what is real and what is substantial. Of course, some of the mainstream media loves to be dismissive and poo-poo towards these flaky people who've been interested in this alternative stuff. But the fact is, it's making its own way into society, and whether it's alternative or complementary or integrative medicine, I mean, how far has that come in the last 40, 45 years? Of course, I think of John Kabat-Zinn when I was at Omega, was doing his mindfulness work, and now he's, the eminence of mindfulness on a worldwide basis. You wouldn't meet a nicer person. But you can just see we could go on and on, so many areas in which these holistic practices, values, ideas have permeated society, but it's been an evolution rather than a revolution. So it's not necessarily headline grabbing unless you're very attuned to it. But those of us who have been attuned to this, it's everywhere. Whether you get an airplane in San Francisco airport, and the first thing you see is some place selling sustainable and green furniture. I mean, once you've got an eye for it, it's increasingly ubiquitous, but not as ubiquitous as it needs to be, but it's getting there. So it's reason for hope, despite the disturbing and crazy times that we live in.
It is everywhere, and it's moving us in a very positive direction. It's being absorbed, and it's really, for a lot of us, mainstream. It's mainstream because in order to keep the earth alive and sustainable, we need to take care of it.
Yeah.
We need to take care of this beautiful planet that we live on.
Yeah.
So I wanted to say, you said a little bit about this, But let me formally ask you, how does the new center build on the open center?
Well, we have a lot of contacts, a lot of expertise, a lot of people who know how to do this. So I, for instance, have, and the other people in the programming field know a lot of the people who are already who have been teaching. They said they taught at the Open Center for many years, and most of them are quite happy to come back and teach at the new center as well.
Mhm.
I mean, they realized that, the Open Center had to deal with its own internal issues. It came to an end after 38 years and whatever, 500,000 participants that came through. But the need for holistic learning hasn't gone away. There's still just as much need for that as ever. So we have to adapt it to a different time and a different format. But yes, if I was doing this entirely from scratch now without, whatever, 45, 50 years worth of experience at the Open Center, and then, before that, I was program director of Omega and ran the programs for the first 2 summers up at the former Camp Boybury, because it used to be as it was when I stumbled across it in the early 80s, just an abandoned old summer camp. Now you wouldn't recognize that that's what it's like today, but I just have a lot of contacts, a lot of and not just me, a lot of experience, and the challenge is to attune to the specific consciousness, what is needed at this particular time, with this dramatic moment that we are in 2025. So I think it requires comparable levels of vision and creativity. And we have many years of experience. We also have new people working with us. So it's great to have people in their 20s and early 30s who are filled with, I mean, I was, 34 when I started the Open Center. Not quite that young anymore. But there's life in the old dog yet, as they say. So yeah.
I would say there's a lot of life with your wisdom, Ralph. You bring great wisdom, and attracting young people allows you to benefit from what they can bring.
Yeah, but there needs to be a combination. So that's what we're working on, is developing a team where there's a really good blend of young, old, and interest in different areas and skills, and people learning skills. So that's what we're doing. But it's kind of unprecedented. It hasn't been done before. So yeah.
And you also stated that the setup is quite modern. You have in-person for intimacy, you
Yeah.
have Zooms for those who want to sit in their living room, and you
Right.
have hybrid to
Yeah.
attract, you have a world audience.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I started something called the Art of Dying programs 30 years ago with Tibet House, our friends at Tibet House, Bob and Nana Thurman and others. Um, and extraordinarily enough, that is still continuing to this day.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, these things are of enduring. I also started something called the Esoteric Quest, this series of conferences on the Western esoteric tradition. Also at the same time, back in 1995, both the Art of Dying and the Esoteric Quest are celebrating their 30th birthday this year. So, they have legs. These are serious topics. One is the rediscovery of the lost spiritual wisdom of the West.
Mhm.
And the other, of course, is the deepest of all topics, death itself. How do we deal with it? How can we approach it in a more holistic way? And even, what do we know about near death, end of life? And what are the wisest perspectives from the Tibetans to Rudolf Steiner about the journey of the soul after death? And of course, that's the good thing about being a free, independent non-profit organization. We don't have to kowtow to mainstream materialistic prejudices in academia or in hospitals or wherever it may be. Although, of course, this stuff is making its way into those spheres as well.
Mhm.
So yeah.
Now it is time for a break. When we come back, I have a great interest in your stories, your true stories from Tibet.
Okay.
Now you are a world traveler.
Hmm.
I'm interested in knowing what you think spurred you to be such an adventurer, coming to the United States, traveling to Tibet, this east to west. So when we come back, listeners, we're going to ask Ralph about that. It's time for a commercial now.
Okay.
Were you an essential worker during the pandemic? If you needed to learn stages of epilepsy, did you depend on advocates? Did you use new innovations to cope with mental and neurological issues? Maintaining high quality of life and keeping good mental health are what we all strive for. I'm Frank R. Harrison, host of Frank About Health, and each week top healthcare influencers, professionals, and innovators answer these questions and more. Stay tuned on Thursdays at 5 p.m. on talkradio.nyc, and I will continue to be frank about health with all of you.
Are you a conscious co-creator? Are you on a quest to raise your vibration and your consciousness? I'm Sam Leibowitz, your conscious consultant, and on my show, The Conscious Consultant Hour, Awakening Humanity, we will touch upon all these topics and more. Listen live at our new time on Thursdays at 12 noon Eastern Time. That's The Conscious Consultant Hour, Awakening Humanity, Thursdays 12 noon on talkradio.nyc.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC at www.talkradio.nyc. Now broadcasting 24 hours a day.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the A Train to Sedona. I'm Linda Marsanico with my guest, Ralph White. Ralph, please unmute yourself. Now, before we left for commercial, I showed an interest in Ralph's being such a world traveler, an adventurer. Ralph, what influenced you to be this adventurer?
I'm just that kind of a guy. I've always wanted to see the world from a very early age, and I did. When I was young, I felt extremely claustrophobic. I spent my first 4 years in these just sort of working class row houses in Cardiff, which is the capital of Wales. It was very, very claustrophobic in those post-war years with the bomb sites and the poverty in general. I just had an impulse to see the world. My nightmare was that, when I was living in the north of England in that industrial town, Huddersfield, in the 60s, I wanted to get out of there. And my nightmare was that I'd be stuck in there, like so many generations of people who'd been working in the factories, that's where, and the mills, the textile mills, that's where the Industrial Revolution had been going for 150 years. So I couldn't actually it's just, I had, I remember living in Vancouver in 72 and seeing a picture of Machu Picchu on somebody's television. And of course, nowadays, everybody knows Machu Picchu, but although all those years ago, I was like, what is that? Here I am for my age, a relatively well-educated person, but I never even heard of Machu Picchu. And I just went, wow, what is that? And I said, I've got to go there. So a friend and I just decided to hitchhike there. We didn't have the money to fly there, but yeah, we hitchhiked there. It took us 6 months, and then I ran out of money and lived in Colombia for a year, which was quite a memorable experience. But also, I've always had a fascination with Tibet. Of course, when I was a boy, Tibet was still the mysterious land of snows. You hadn't had the Chinese invasion. And there was something there, just like there was something in those ancient, in the pyramids in Teotihuacan outside Mexico City. I didn't even know the largest pyramids in the world were in Mexico, not in Egypt. All those pre-Columbian cultures and then Tibet and stuff, old forgotten mysteries. I just had the sense that the modern materialistic worldview that was offered us through contemporary education didn't look deeply enough. There were all kinds of ancient civilizations that needed to be understood and respected. And so I think that was, but more than anything, it's just it's just an urge, it's an urge to embrace the world. I remember meditating at the Open Center after the first 5 years, and it just came to me, I need to go around the world. And I always wanted to do that. So I took a sabbatical from the Open Center and went around the world for a year and absolutely loved it. That's where I had that adventure in Tibet. Um, it's just I know what I think some people just have that itch, if you want to call it that, maybe, or that impulse just to get out there and embrace the world and see it and to live it as fully as possible. And also, of course, I mean, my sister's the exact opposite. She spent her life she's still in that town in the north of England that we went to when I was 9. She married a French guy, so she does have a larger view of the world. She gets away to France quite often. But it's just me. I mean, it's not like it was something to do with our family. It's just my particular chemistry or my spiritual orientation. But it's just an impulse to embrace the world and to live life as fully as possible.
That's inspiring. Now, I want to cite the story, A Walk on the Wild Side of Tibet, published in Tibet. True Stories, Traveler's Tales, 2003. So you published this in 2003?
Right. Yes, I guess that was 2003, yeah.
And I would imagine your walk on the wild side happened a bit before then. So can you share that story, if you don't mind?
Yeah, sure. Well, it was actually 1989. And I had taken that sabbatical, and I was traveling around the world. And I spent a month in the Nechung Monastery in Dharamsala, which is where the Dalai Lama's government in exile is in northwest India. So that's the real Tibetan center of Tibetan culture outside. And outside the country. And so I had, thanks to a connection with a friend, I had spent a month in the Nechung Monastery, the monastery of the state oracle. Really, virtually the last surviving oracle in the world, where the Nechung Chogyam, the Nechung deity, the protective deity of Tibet and the Dalai Lama, actually speaks through a monk. And I happened to be there in my little room, and I'd wake up in the morning and I'd hear these deep chants, that's Tibetan, and the blasts of the trumpets. And it turned out to be a 5-day ritual invoking Peha Gyalpo, the protective deity. So I asked if I could go down there and meditate with them. So I just sat at the back while the monks, it's a working monastery with virtually only 1 or 2 Westerners there, while they did this ritual. And anyway, obviously I didn't contribute. I just sat there and tuned into the vibe. But then later, I spent there a month. The head monk came to me and asked me if I would do something to. They needed help getting something into Tibet, and it was impossible for Tibetan to do it. They were just examined too closely. He'd heard I was planning to take the first flight of the year. I think it was May 1st from Kathmandu to Lhasa, but it was 1959. So anyway, he asked me, would I take this material into Tibet for them, and he said they put me under the protection of the Peha Gyalpo. They put a kata scarf around my neck, and I said, sure, I'll do it. I thought I'd just fly into the airport and it'd be confiscated or whatever.
Ralph, did you know what the material was?
Yes, I did. But,
okay.
Yeah, and but it was all in Tibetan, so I couldn't read it. So, I knew the general thing, but I did, obviously I can't read a word of Tibetan. So anyway, what happened was it was 1959, so there were uprisings against the Chinese, because it's the 30th anniversary of the Dalai Lama's flight in 1959 from Tibet. And just merely to demonstrate in favor of that, to hold up a cardboard box with a Tibetan flag chalked on it was enough for people to be killed. So there was a lot of repression going on in Lhasa. So all Westerners were thrown out of the country, so there'd be nobody to see it. And so it became impossible to fly into Lhasa for that. So so it looked like it would be impossible to do what I promised to do. But then I met somebody, a Chinese Canadian guy actually, who was doing a book on trekking in Tibet. People had just been allowed to enter Tibet and to trek around Mount Kailash. And he told me about a route into eastern Tibet, last done in 1923. And there was an article about it in the National Geographic of 23 or 26, something like that. Joseph Rock, a real explorer, had been to the land of the Yellow Llama about entering Tibet through from Sichuan. So to cut a long story short, that's what I wound up doing. I wound up crossing into going to Sichuan, Yunnan, Luku Lake, crossing the mountains over there into eastern Tibet. You know, people think of Tibet as a flat plateau, like, well, with monks and monasteries, but eastern Tibet is called the land of four rivers, six ranges, four of the great rivers that water the whole of Asia, all through a fairly narrow area. So it's got huge valleys, the deepest valleys I've ever seen. And the people who live there are the Khampas, Khampas, and they're the wild Tibetan cowboys and warriors. All the men have long hair. They all have a lot of jewelry. They wear cowboy hats. Most of them have swords, and some of them they have crack shots, and they're considered some of the finest horsemen in Asia. They protected the eastern borders of Tibet for a long time. So this was at the time forbidden territory. So anyway, so I'm not going to go into the details of it, but essentially I was able to make that journey into that part of Tibet and pass on the material to people who said they could get it to where it needed to go. So it wasn't possible to actually get to Lhasa because that was the whole of official Tibet was under martial law. But those borderlands there of eastern Tibet, Kham, and which were basically they were Tibetans considered that part of Tibet, and then of China sort of appropriated it and announced that it was part of Sichuan instead. But yeah, that's what I did, and I managed to do it and get out in one piece. But when I got back, when I had left to go into the mountains, the whole Tiananmen Square thing was just brewing. I didn't know what would happen. It was only when I got back from the mountains into China a month later that I found that the Tiananmen Square massacre had taken place. I had no idea. I was concerned I was the last Western person left in China because I couldn't see anybody else. But there were still a few left. But yeah, I saw the aftermath of Tiananmen Square and the smashed windows and the burned out buildings of Communist Party headquarters and so on. And of course, that's all been, I would say, in China, of course, it's been covered up. And China today is a very different place. You know, I actually was invited back to China some years ago before the pandemic and to meet some of the holistic pioneers. I gave the opening talk at the first international holistic wellness forum outside Beijing. You know, it was like an hour outside, a half outside Beijing. It was a total recreation of 17th or 18th century Beijing. I mean, there were pagodas, there were lakes, there was even a functioning monastery there. It was an extraordinary experience. To walk around there at dusk, you really felt like you were back in 17th century China or something like that. Anyway, so that was, and I met a lot of, thanks to a Chinese friend of mine who took me around the country and introduced me to a lot of holistic pioneers. You know, there's an awakening going on in China, which we never see written about. You've got, you know, Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, because you've got a couple of 100 million people in China lifted out of pure subsistence. And so they can engage with larger questions, education, self-actualization, and all that kind of thing. And so you've got now loads and loads of people, particularly young women in the cities, who are educated. Some of them are traveled, and they have the same spiritual interests that we do. You know, I mean, in all those years at the Open Center, I always wanted to be very multicultural and include all the cultures and the coherent spiritual paths. But, you know, even one tended to forget 22% of humanity. You know, those Chinese, they're over there doing their thing. It's communist, spirituality is repressed. You know, all they're interested in is military power and, you know, economic growth and producing more cars and all the rest of it. But it's not true. They're just like us. And there are a lot of wonderful people. So, what made me feel ultimately, I don't know how many generations it's going to take, but ultimately there is a spiritual awakening happening in China, and of course they're heirs to a phenomenal heritage. I mean, the government is not being so oppressive about indigenous stuff like Taoism and Buddhism to some extent, and of course they love Confucianism because it supports hierarchy and all the rest of it. But that's one of my hopes for the world, is that China will eventually reawaken to its amazing spiritual heritage.
Yes, thank you for that. Now, we need to take a break. When we come back, I'm interested in what was your mood, your feelings when you were trying to bring this material, as you had promised, to where it needed to be brought. You didn't get to Lasso, but you did have this mission. And I'm wondering about the reflective Ralph. What was the experience like? But we do need to take a break. And when we come back, listeners, we're going to hear a deeper, a reflective Ralph White.
Hey everybody, it's Tommy D, the nonprofit sector connector, coming at you from my attic. Each week here on talkradio.nyc, I host the program Philanthropy in Focus. Nonprofits impact us each and every day, and it's my focus to help them amplify their message and tell their story. Listen each week at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time until 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, right here on talkradio.nyc.
Hi, I'm Linda Marsanico. The A Train to Sedona is a memoir about my journey to love and compassion. It's also the name of my new broadcast on Wednesdays at 12 noon. When we are spiritual, we embrace possibilities and ideas, which strengthen our mind, body, spirit, health, and wisdom. On the A Train to Sedona broadcast, I plan to interview guests who embrace these expansive practices. Join us on Wednesdays at 12 noon on Talk Radio New York City.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC at www.talkradio.nyc. Now broadcasting 24 hours a day.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the A Train to Sedona. I'm Linda Marsanico with my guest, Ralph White. So, Ralph, please unmute yourself.
Okay.
So I'm wondering, I think that I would be having to meditate and mantra myself during such a mission to reduce my parasympathetic nerve, to increase my parasympathetic nervous system's effect on the sympathetic nervous system. So what was your internal Ralph experiencing on this mission?
Well, of course, spending that month in the Nechung Monastery, surrounded by one of their deepest spiritual practices, it definitely deeply attuned me to the Tibetan spirit. And, I couldn't say these things for sure, but, I suspect I actually was touched by the spirit of Peha Gyalpo. Something definitely, I would never have done that by myself, if I hadn't been asked. So, yeah, I mean, so that first of all, I had that sense of inspiration and conviction that this was something worth doing, although I thought I would just be flying in initially. During the actual month or so that I was in the Himalayas there in the borderlands of eastern Tibet and Yunnan, there was no time. It was so exhausting physically. We were up at such high altitude. I was up at 12, 13, 14,000 feet a lot of the time, and there were no maps. I had an old 1919 map from the heyday of the British Empire. So it was more a question of endurance. But it was also, even though I'm not sitting there meditating, but I don't think any of the people I traveled with along the way, including a young Sino-Tibetan guide over these really remote mountains, nobody was into spiritual practice except the monks in the monasteries. So it was more a question of just being surrounded by this stunning beauty.
Mm.
I mean, I remember being way up on this mountain ridge, and suddenly this gorgeous, perfect cone-shaped snow-capped mountain appeared in the far, far distance to the east. And the Tibetans all shouting, Gongashan, Gongashan, the holy mountain, which was surrounded in mists, I don't know, a huge percentage of the time. And it rarely revealed itself, and I happened to be there. So suddenly I'm gazing in wonder at this gorgeous mountain I'd never even heard before. I mean, it looked like it was, as high as Everest, or virtually. It isn't, but it rises up from a much lower level than Everest, so it's striking. So I was surrounded by that kind of beauty. And also, the Tibetans I met were so charming. They're so gracious, so helpful. So yeah, I didn't. I must have meditated a few. There were definitely a few. Oh well, no, actually, there was a moment. Yes, now that I recall it. Yes, in that Tibetan story where I'd come down into this village, it felt like a pretty criminal village. The people there were really seedy. I wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. This is somewhat still in the Chinese speaking world, and I needed to leave fast, just get out. So I started hiking along this remote trail by the side of a river, and it seemed to come to an absolute dead end. And it looked like, well, what am I going to do? I can't go back to that village. This looks like a complete dead end. And so that was a moment where I did draw upon my years of meditating, and I did find a comfortable rock to sit on and meditate and just chill out and just relax, calm, just go forward. I walked another, quarter of a mile forward. It was clear the river just took a 90-degree turn. It wasn't an absolute dead end. The river turned and the path by the river turned as well. And then a few minutes later, a young Tibetan on a white horse rode up. And, obviously we can only exchange a few words, but I told him what I was going, Dao Chang. He says, Dao Chang, there. And, so that was the one time I really remember drawing upon my meditative resources to get out of what felt like an extremely stressed and tight corner.
Yes, interesting how what seemed like a dead end was an opening. And you know what that reminds me of? I don't know whether you read Harry Potter. I read all of
I
them.
read one.
I think there were 8 or 9 books. And in the early books, Harry talks about the Marauder's map. And it's a map you take, which is blank. It doesn't show up until you make a decision. And then when you make a decision, your path is shown. So when you see that, what you think is a dead end, and it's an opening to a river, and then being a person, a man on a white horse shows you the way to your destination, it sounds magical to me.
It was just a huge relief to me at a time, from high stress to major relief. I mean, I was still a long way from where I needed to be, but at least I was going in the right direction.
And did you have food with you and water?
Yeah, well, or I just, got food from the villages that I passed through. Water, because you had to have little, purifying pills if you're drinking water out of streams. Unfortunately, I never got sick on that whole month because I was scrupulous about using water purification pills. I ate some pretty awful food, though. The people who live on those borderlands of China and Tibet live in such poverty. I mean, just there's nothing to eat in those villages except, I mean, of course, this is 30 years ago or more, but they live, just white rice and luncheon meat, spam. I mean, just you start fantasizing about just an egg. Can I just have an egg? And it's nothing there. So I feel a lot of compassion for those people. We're up in these remote villages, felling trees and in the mountains, and surviving on virtually nothing. And yeah, some of the young Tibetan guys I met were just sent there after they graduated, no choice. They just had to man a remote outpost in Tibet with nothing going on around them, nothing to do except a ping pong table. I mean, sure, by now they probably have the internet, but all those
And
years,
cell phones.
yeah, it was a very isolating life. I have nothing, the Chinese people I met were, most of them were perfectly friendly and helpful. And I felt a lot of compassion actually for the very limited lives that they were forced to leave and only allowed to go back and see their families, even their wives, twice a year.
From the remote areas.
From the post that they were sent to along the road between Litang and Batang, and
Fascinating, all this, and what little we know. And I'm so
yeah, well,
thankful for your
I really
story.
hope, one hopes, because the worst scenario for the 21st century would be a hot war between the US and China. I mean, that's the last thing we want. So any kind of citizens diplomacy, as it used to be, just any kind of interaction between us and the Chinese people, it's greatly to be supported and favored.
I agree totally. I want to recite one of your quotes from your website. You speak about, quote, creating a more holistic, ecological, conscious, and just society. And it sounds like your life has focused on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, what else is there to do? I mean, you want to have fun, of course, and you want to enjoy life as fully as you can. But yeah, I mean, that's really been the guiding impulse in my life since I had, that my own awakening in the deserts of New Mexico and in the Andes and so on. So yeah, that's what it's all about. That's what I want to do, and I can't say it's been a vehicle to a great deal of material prosperity, but that's never been one of my goals. It's to do what you just said there. So yeah, it's challenging. It ain't easy. I mean, you're going against the grain, even now in 2025, let alone compared to 40, 45 years ago. We're still going against the grain in general of mainstream society, but it's more and more widespread. And there's more and more receptivity to it. And there are also plenty of contrary forces as well, to say the least. And but we're not going to give up because we know that this is the way the world needs to go for a viable and sustainable future.
Yes, indeed. Ralph, how can people find you?
Well, there's the New Center's website, newcenterny.org. There's I'm going to be doing actually the 30th anniversary Esoteric Quest conference in Switzerland in September. It's an esoteric quest for the Mountain of Truth, Monte Verita, which is where the counterculture was born at the beginning of the 20th, 1901. It didn't start in California, as most people think in the 60s. It actually started on the shores of Lago Maggiore in 1901. All the things we associate with the counterculture were all being pioneered then. And we think of people like many of us have read Hermann Hesse, at least maybe it's just my generation, but we all loved Hermann Hesse. But Hermann Hesse, Isadora Duncan, all these amazing people were all there at this Monte Verita, the Mountain of Truth. And we're going to start off at the retreat center that Jung himself used many times, Eranos, which is just on the shores of the lake, where a lot of the most brilliant minds before the 60s, before psychedelics, in between the 30s and 50s, these extraordinary people would gather with Jung in the Eranos retreat there to understand, the way archetypes, the collective unconscious, mythology, that deeper understanding than just mainstream academic philosophy and purely materialistic world conception. So yeah, so there's esotericquest.org. The Art of Dying, we're currently reimagining. We're going to relaunch the Art of Dying programs in September, but there's artofdying.org. And then there's my own website, ralphwhite.net. And then I want to point people towards, if there's any viewers or listeners out there who are involved with a holistic center of some sort. I've been attending this annual Holistic Centers gathering. It's amazing. It's 40 years now. But we're going to be doing it at a retreat center called the Guest House Retreat Center in Connecticut. And that is taking place in mid-May for 5 days. And it's really an opportunity for holistic centers around the country and internationally. We're going to be joined by people doing this work, because it's a mistake to think this is just in North America. There are centers in Europe, in Asia, and South America. And it's a fine way to put your finger on the pulse of what's happening in the whole holistic movement, for want of a better phrase. And it's a meeting of it's just very convivial, very relaxed, very candid. It's about speaking openly and honestly. And we didn't do a gathering last year because different things were happening, but I'm looking forward to just talking to peers again. What's going on? What works? What doesn't? What are you seeing? What are your challenges? What are your successes? So I want to encourage. I don't think they have a website. If you go, I think Guest House must have its own retreats, its own website, but I know they have a Facebook page for the center. So if you
also, Ralph, they can reach out to you because you have a contact me.
Yeah, that's right. You could reach out to me through my website, and I can put anybody in touch about the center's gathering in mid-May in Connecticut. But if you're running a center, because many people, when they start centers, they can feel very alone. And it's good for us all to be connected to there's strength in numbers, especially at a disturbing time like the one we're living in right now.
We do need to close. I wanted to thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, my pleasure.
And I wanted to say, listeners, that next week I have as my guest Stephanie McAuliffe, who writes about the energy of boundaries and the divine feminine. See you next time.
All right. Thank you, Linda.